So for Lab 7, you guys are going to be getting started writing the introduction for your fMRI paper. So I'm going to go over some guidelines for that. Generally, research papers tend to follow a similar structure in their introductions. So in the first paragraph, you'll typically introduce the general topic and why it's important to study. Then you might spend a couple paragraphs going over the background literature, what kind of related research has already been done, what do we already know about this topic, and then finally, what will the current study add to the field, and what are the hypothesized results for this study. So as I'm grading your papers, there's a couple things I'll be looking for. One is making sure that your introduction matches APA guidelines. That's going to include things like having 12-point font, double-spaced. A common mistake people make is putting the title of the paper right in front of the introduction or having the word introduction at the top. You don't need that. The title should just be on the title page. The first paragraph of the introduction should motivate the research question, explaining why we want to study this topic. And then the content of cited sources is used effectively to motivate the hypothesis. The primary focus of each cited source is directly relevant to the topic. Cited sources provide sufficient background so that the reader can understand the study. So this is where you should be pulling from your annotated bibliography to take a look at previous research related to the topic and see what's been done before. And finally, a clear statement of the hypothesis is included in the final paragraph in the introduction with specific predictions. The final paragraph of the introduction also briefly introduces the paradigm. So, what method are we using? What's the sort of 1 or 2 sentence summary of the study? So I think the most challenging part of the introduction is really doing the background literature review, synthesizing the papers you found from your annotated bibliography, and connecting them to the current study. So let's talk about that a little bit. So remember that the question that you're really trying to answer with this paper is, how does the brain response differ when encoding word pairs compared to face occupation pairs? And so really what we want to do with our introduction is give readers an overview of research that's been done already related to this topic. So as you go through the papers you've already found in your annotated bibliography, there's a couple things that you should consider. For example, what does this paper tell us about brain regions that might be involved in encoding word pairs or face occupation pairs? If you have papers that are looking at things like this, that's great. This would be the most directly relevant to the analyses that we're doing in this paper. You could also consider, what does this paper tell us about brain regions involved in associative memory? So maybe you found papers that don't use word pairs or face occupation pairs, but some other pairs of data that people are trying to memorize. And what kind of brain activation do we see in those studies? Or maybe you found papers that aren't really quite associative memory ones, but they are looking at how people encode faces or words. That could also be relevant, and that could be something that you could still incorporate into your introduction. And finally, what are some of the common findings across studies? You don't just want to write a laundry list of what different studies have found, you want to synthesize them in some way and connect it to your hypotheses for the current study. So you want to be able to use what people have found before to help justify your hypotheses for this study. All right, as you're going through your introduction, one of the things that takes a while to get used to is APA-style citations. So let's just go over some examples. One way you can cite a paper is you describe their results and then you put the author's names and the publication year in parentheses. You could also mention the name of the authors in your sentence, in which case you just need the publication year in parentheses. And if you're citing multiple sources to back something up, then you can list them one after the other, just separated by a semicolon. And the other thing to remember is that the format for citations changes a little bit depending on how many authors you have. So if you have one author, then it's just their last name and the year. If you have 2 authors, then you would list both of their last names and the year. And if you have 3 or more authors, you don't need to write out all of their names, just the first author's last name, et al., and the year.